Hello, you are on Route 1. In a few moments, the panel The Good Paying State and the Importance of Guarantees will start. Explore mechanisms that increase the reliability of state payments for investors in UPP. In particular, the role of guarantees in context of limited fiscal capacity. The moderator will be the leading capital market specialist of the beach, Prats.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joan Prats. I work at the Capital Market Divisions and Finance. I am the leader expert in sovereign management, sovereign risks management, financial analyst, and I work with the structuring financial regulation. I've been working on this for over 15 years. I have the pleasure to moderate this session that will address the reliable payer state, the reliable payer state, and also we want to improve the PPP's projects. We have here excellent speakers. We have Mario Engler. Mario is PhD in law and coordinator of MBA of the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. And we also have Rogério Princhak. Rogério is a civil engineer, graduated by the University of Bahia, and also is executive secretary of the PPP's units of Salvador, Bahia. He's been working with this for 13 years. He is professor in several universities, and he's helping several PPP projects. We also have here Julio Montoya, which is an expert in investment banking. He, with more than 20 years of experience, he works with aerospatial engineering. He's graduated by the Colorado Springs. We are going to organize the panel. I will ask questions to each speaker, the first question, in order to get into context, and then we are going to have a round of comments and discussions among us to discuss the different issues. Pandemic. There's no doubt that pandemic has established risk and uncertainties as one of the most important topics to take into account when we design any project, structure, project, and it has have great impacts on PPPs. In addition, PPPs are requiring more and more state support or government support with different structures. I would like to ask first to Mario, because of his broad experience between the intersection of legal, economic, and finances, according to your experience and your studies, which are the main elements of a good institutional framework in order to provide credibility to the state payments, and which are the good practices that you would recommend? You're mute.
I'm going to speak in Portuguese, John. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to say good afternoon and hello to everyone, and I would like to express my thanks for participating in this panel with Micro Isadora. Everybody's jealous of you because you are personally participating here in this panel. Rogério, and going straight to this issue, I have 5 comments to make. It doesn't mean that these 5 comments will simply exhaust all the best practices or improvement of the institutional framework. On the administration side, I would say that the first point to be considered to increase the credibility of the payment commitments that the government has to honor, which are the PPP projects. According to the Brazilian legislation, you might have to go through 8 different administrations sometimes. So this is a project which is a long-term project. So my first comment is that projects that must be perceived regarding a consensus, a political and social that they all agree that it is considered really important for the population at large. These projects will have more probability of being accepted and respected, and the payments will be honored by the administration. To choose good projects is the first step. The second step has to do with the track record. The past history of respecting contracts here in Brazil, debt, real estate debt at the federal government has credibility so far. It's an enormous credibility, but the contractual government, the contractual debt of the federal administration does not have the same credibility because there is a past of stories of financial debts not being paid in detriment of others. So this history of respecting and honoring contracts and of not having opportunistic conduct, I think that this is the second point that strengthens a lot this institutional framework in favor of the increase of credibility of these commitments. The third one that I would like to mention is the fiscal responsibility, the fiscal accountability. We must not lose sight of the importance of fiscal responsibility. We are experiencing at this moment what the perception of the market regarding the commitment of the government, especially the federal administration, with the fiscal accountability. What impact can this cause? And so the spending limits here with commitments of payments that were signed in the PPP contracts, I don't see this as something negative. I think this is positive because on one hand, it limits the possibility of hiring and contracting more PPP contracts. But on the other hand, there is this effect of imposing a very clear limit. And this is something that's going to strengthen the responsibility of an administration, the fiscal administration of an administration, and this will improve the perception of the future commitment of these payments. The fourth point that I would like to mention here, and now going to proposals that would demand a change in the legislative nature and even constitutional, which is the mandatory budget for certain expenses. Brazil has experience of certain expenses that are binding, and they have to be prioritized. And this binding is that when it is included in the budget proposal. The budget is approved annually. If you have 35 years for payment, you have to have 35 contracts with the commitments of PPP. So we need a change, an alteration of this budget that for authorization, and another one, a binding one. This might strengthen enormously in institutional terms this payment commitment. And finally, and this would be a more daring step, is to consider these payment commitments in the same level of payment. They have to be considered on the same level as the PPP contracts, the same treatment as if it were a financial debt. So the way to deal with this from the budget point of view and from the budget execution, of course, this has a different logic which will favor the strengthening of this payment commitment. This is a more daring step. This is something that would demand changes, certainly in the law of fiscal accountability in Brazil, but it would strengthen these payments. Let us remember that real guarantees is something that is finite. So even though we want to strengthen the commitment, the payment commitment structuring modalities that use real guarantee, but there are limits, and you cannot think that this is going to be a solution, in my opinion at least, that will solve all this problem for the future in the long term. This, Joan, is what I had to say. Thank you.
It's there, and Isadora is also joining the panel. She's the partner of Eco Consulting. It's a consultancy specialized in PPPs, and she also has a broad experience as a chief of the PPP unit in São Paulo. But before going to her, let me first ask Rogério. Rogério, given your experience in structuring projects and given what has happened with the pandemic and the uncertainties the pandemic is bringing to the infrastructure world, what do you think could be the role of the state in its payments and in providing and facilitating structuring in the PPP projects, and which could be the role of guarantees in providing better structuring for the PPP projects?
Joan, boa tarde.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with Mario and Julio, that both collaborated, and Isadora as well, participated, Isadora, Rogério, and Mario. And this was coordinated by Caroline. So what I would say is the following. What Mario said, I agree with him. The first point of a state is to build a PPP portfolio. When you have this portfolio of PPP, you have to show credibility in this structure that, of course, as it was said, through the elaboration of good projects. I think this is fundamental. You have to have good projects. Secondly, you need a story, a history. And during 13 years, you must have a history of a good payer, that you pay on the due date all the contracts that were signed. The third important point is that you have to map. When you talk about guarantees, you have to map, create, and also always innovate. The innovation has to be included in the contract with the learning of all the international entities in Latin America with determining the specific risks. Risks like exchange risks. This is something that was covered very well by the Paulista Highway Association. And it's very important that you should be concerned with certain risks, because when you have a new role of the BNDES Bank, the development bank, by investment funds, international funds, you have to mitigate certain risks. So this was very important. This is something São Paulo did, and we in the state of Bahia, we have followed this, and the contracts have been signed, and the contract must also have that we have included this issue of exchange rate. Colombia also presents a very interesting situation to be applied in some other Latin American countries, perhaps. Here in Brazil, I think it's more complicated to do this because you need a regulatory structure and a very strong control agency, which is to define, to hedge everything in dollar. In Colombia, there are two highways. One that the payments 58%, which is almost ready, with 58% of the payment will be in US dollars. And these operations have to be hedged with the possibility of resources with external currency, and the payment and it has to be payable by the bank, and this has always to be included. Why am I saying this? Because we have to include this and to see what the risks are and how are we going to guarantee the payment of these risks if it's not mapped, plotted. For example, I was saying the risk of exchange, there's also the risk of demand, which is very important for you to determine in the highway. You have to define the ranges of demand. And the pandemic, as you said, brought up a new challenge. And this new challenge you had here in Brazil, the majority of the contracts here, and Mario may add something to this, is the issue of force majeure. This is something, force majeure is something that you never expected. Any contract to be signed has to have the force majeure, because the Brazilian legislation included the risk if there is force majeure in the state. So when the pandemic appeared, and this is something that is concerning, and it's a point to be discussed, which is some states started innovating with certain theories to share certain risks. Of course, these are risks that should be. And what about, isn't this going to affect the contract? Yes, but I understand that acts of God, when they happen, in this history of the payments of each contracting force, it has to be very clear, and you have to negotiate the payment of these contracts. So some contracts, these are all very long-term contracts, but you have to understand the size of it. For example, transport, mobility with the risk of demand, and not inventing certain theories saying that this risk has to be shared because this is going to affect the granting power, that they should accept this risk. So this was discussed here in Brazil regarding who would accept the case. Of course, the most affected, which is the highway and the urban mobility, due to the restrictions of transporting people. And during the pandemic, people had to stay at home. So this had an effect in the demand for transport. So this is very important, and we have to take this into account. The important thing is also that there were some opinions that I consider very important, which is to say what is obvious, that in the case of acts of God, what has to be done is to have a dialogue regarding, this dialogue has to be included in the PPPs in a transparent way so that you can agree and you can sign, because there was an imbalance between the granting power regarding its possibilities of paying due to a resource that he might have to spend that was not included, was not foreseen. Now, the quality of this risk has to be maintained in what was agreed upon. And another point which I think is very interesting about this with the pandemia is that the PPP, you can measure it by efficiency. I think this is a point. You have to restudy this project, and for this you have a percentage of the share of payment in the Brazilian structure. It has to be variable, but this variable share cannot be arbitrated. The total of receivables, the total to be paid by the government, by the administration, you cannot speculate or judge if it's going to be 20 or 30%. It depends on each project. It depends on the maintenance of the rate, the quota of the debt, and this cannot affect the service to be rendered. So this pandemia has affected all the contracts, not only the pandemia, but all the concerns that are included in PPP have to be like the determination of what is going to be variable regarding the study, the project itself that has to be carried out, the project that has to be made so that you can see the risk mitigation and how can you mitigate this risk, of course, in the fiscal responsibility that each country must have. So answering your question, the pandemic, yes, brought us a challenge, and here in Brazil, this is a typical case of acts of God, and I think there's nothing that I think it's wrong to keep bringing theories whether this risk has to be shared or not, but in these contracts, I think we should have a renegotiation. And I think the companies have to understand this, and the service has to be continued. So basically, I think this is what I wanted to say. The structuring of the project goes through many challenges. You have to determine correctly, you have to identify correctly the risk matrix regarding your contract, and then you have to have a history of good payer, and especially with what refers to the partners that are the hidden partners that you do not have. And then adding to what Mario said, the concern of not having the off balance, that is, the registration of that expense has to be in the balance sheet, and it has to be included in the liability, it has to be included in the sanitary expense of the following year. There are many concerns which have to be considered so that you may, obviously, according to the contract, it's impossible to have a perfect contract. The transaction cost would be terribly high, that's obvious. So you have to map out the quality and know how to map these risks in a responsible way, keeping the quality of the service provided, the productivity of the project, and the tax responsibilities. And the pandemic brought us a challenge and even a test for the federal government regarding the compliance to contracts without new theories going against the acts of God that the Brazilian government always respected. That's what I had to say.
Thank you very much. So you have covered lots of different subjects. All the points you've raised about the importance of measuring well, taking into account all the risks that the government is taking, and that will have to take even more risk with the pandemic. And in the credibility that was built in a long-term relationship with a relationship of trust with a company. So everyone is exposed to their own risks and the cost and all the risk that is produced as the project unfolds. So we're talking about 15, 20 years in a relationship of trust. Trust needs to be established, and this is important. Now, Julio, I have a question to you. Can you talk about the topic of how, from a financial structuring perspective, how do you read the commitment that the public sector assumes and how this can be adapted to ease funding and access to the banking market? What are the lessons learned that you could share with us? Okay, yes. So we will be discussing then the topic of funding operations as Mario and Rogério have commented. And this is very clear. So for funding purposes, a principle is that a bad project will never become good, even if there's guarantee. It has to be born as a good project and that can be improved over time. In this respect, the points that were raised are crucial, in my opinion. Currently, in our regional countries, the pre-pandemic times, they had some level of investment, and there was some adjustment with the pandemic. And then the problem will maybe remain for a while, but the government won't consider the problem as a risk of the counterparty, but the agency that is managing the contract. For this reason, experience is crucial and correct structuring is also key. And we are now entering infrastructure sectors where you have multiple variables as compared to infrastructure as a gas pipeline that is more specific. And we have multiple infrastructure projects, hospitals, and many others. So it's crucial that the administrative or government counterparty should have the experience to contract appropriately and is empowered to manage such a contract. Many cases were mentioned in this region, in our region, were very relevant, very important projects. They had all the structuring that was needed, provided by the government, but they couldn't count with the elements that were needed to manage the contract, including the evaluation of methods of payment as the operation unfolded, and that might lead to late delays in the development of the project and also funding problems. And for me, this is crucial. You need experience, you need to hire all the elements, you need to empower all the actors or stakeholders, and all the elements should be managed appropriately, including all the technical elements, to make sure that liquidity is achieved, that payment is made. And this is very important. As we discussed earlier in our region, most of the problems are associated with PPPs. That includes liquidity problems, delay in payment, penalties that are very costly, and then penalty that is technically incorrect. And this might lead to problems that are extraordinary, including arbitration processes that are not exactly appealing. So complementary liquidity guarantees have been helping and will help us in the future to strengthen the administration of contracts. And this can contribute a lot, not only in terms of the guarantee itself, the design of this guarantee, technical aspects that governments may take advantage of all regional expertise, in the administration of contracts. And as I said, we have many multiple variables in infrastructure, including hospitals and many other infrastructure projects. So we need to hire experienced actors. Thank you very much, Julio. That was great. What you said about liquidity guarantees in terms of from the perspective of the IBD and other banks that provide support. How can we support these liquidity guarantees from the very beginning? And also as forms of contingency, because the risk that takes place in this country is the price of these guarantees, and then the role of public banks. We've been working hard, and we want to keep working and provide funding. How can we make credit and guarantee translate that into funding construction projects for us to ensure long-term funding and maintenance of these projects? How can we be as efficient as possible? How can private banks provide support? Because we have capital markets, and they evolve in very particular ways. They're highly volatile. So maybe, how can we ensure that public banks play a role and make sure that you have long-term funding? In addition, I'd like to ask about, well, how happy we are, and you have led a very important study about capacity studies and supportive payment by the state. So can you talk about your major findings and conclusions, and what are the most important points for the future? Can you share that with us?
I'm assuming the question was asked to me?
Yes, Isadora, this was the question to you. The problem is that we are a little late. We're waiting for simultaneous translation. I'll speak in Portuguese.
I'm going to speak Portuguese. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you all for your brilliant input. It's a shame you're not here in person with us today, because there's a very significant in-person attendance with brilliant men and women, and I would like to emphasize that it's a beautiful event that gets better edition after edition. I would say that the panelists before me addressed every aspect considered for this joint work. As Rogério Princhak said, a coordination led by Carolina. There were very significant, that led to all of us to reflect the certainty and the confidence in payments from the state. When we see ourselves before a decision-making moment to invest or not, there's lots of factors that we take into consideration, and to add to all of those aspects already mentioned by my colleagues, which were all very relevant, and I would like to add another two. The first one is testing the resilience of the contracts. That has to do with one of the aspects of the public-private partnerships, that is flexibility. Flexibility is the more prepared governments are, the more flexible the PPPs can be. And that's to avoid significant hurdles, significant hiccups whenever a political cycle is concluded, so that we can avoid things like the pandemics, for example. The pandemics made us think that we had to improve our mechanisms and also test our institutions. And why? Just like Rogério said, it was an act of God. It was a force majeure. And it's something that we had never dealt with. And of course, it was something unforeseeable when contracts had been drafted. And the parties to the contract and also the investors saw themselves in a moment that was conflictual, that was belligerent, when it should be a moment of consensus, agreement, dialogue, so that we could all work to mitigate impact and preserve the continuity of the contract. So this, I believe, makes us have to dedicate a lot to dispute resolution and all the different mechanisms for dispute resolution. We need fluidity because parties must accept that there will be gaps in a contract. Unfortunately, there is no contract that can foresee each and everything that might happen in a 30-year period. And this is why we need a methodology that addresses the possible gaps, so that when there is a moment of stress, parties can come to an agreement. Professor Maria, he participated in this award for those who performed really well in view of the pandemic impacts. And one of the awarded was a project from the state of Minas Gerais. And why was it awarded? Because performance indicators were flexibilized by the state. So there were performance indicators that would determine the quality of the project. But in times of such stress, the government, together with the concessionaire, were able to get together and agree on a certain flexibilization. But this was made possible because they were able to discuss, they were able to communicate and preserve the continuity of the services rendered, with the prospect of improvement once the resumed growth. So this brings me to the beginning of my speech. We need to address challenges that make us have to step outside our comfort zone, because the government agent that makes decisions is under a lot of pressure. And this pressure comes from those who may not be ready to be more flexible in a negotiation with the concessionaire. This makes the government officials in charge of that really nervous. But now, with the pandemic, we had to analyze the way these PPPs take place all over the world. We need more resilient contracts. We need more skilled government officials that are more trained to deal with this kind of thing. And also, Joan, to add to something you mentioned, something I found very interesting. Your question was, what can we multilateral banks do to contribute? And you also asked about the evolution of the capital market. The pandemic enhanced the S&G standards, but I'll get there. Let me say something. Public banks in Brazil, especially the National Bank of Development, BNDES, worked hard to focus on what we've just said, that is, support the public sector in the structuring of good projects that can be financed. I believe the IDB and other multilateral institutions are focusing more in that, and that's why I say that the National Bank of Development here has contributed. The World Bank, the IDB, other multilateral institutions, it is important to notice that there are emerging countries that still need to emerge. And what is required for those projects to solidify? We need capacity building. We need those involved in the decision making to understand resilience of contracts. As for the market capital, there's something that was studied by the IDB and also FGV, and now I'm going to make a reference to my dear professor, Mario. This paper helped us understand how the capital markets are more and more an alternative to support the structuring of these projects. But alone, it's still not able to provide for all the investments required to give us the infrastructure that we need. Most recent numbers still show that we have a long way to go. The capital market is increasing its presence, but it will not be able to fill all this gap. And now, as for the S&G, Joan, did you know that in 2020, federal government regulated green bonds? Here we have those bonds with tax incentives, tax benefits for those who purchase them. And the IDB and FGV together, and I was honored to be part of this project, we studied and realized that the return rate of green bonds for those who purchase the bonds, the return rate is higher than the one of the bonds with the incentives, the tax incentives. And one more thing that I would like to say, also something to bring to the table for us to discuss. What are the criteria required to classify a project as sustainable? And finally, to conclude, I'll link to what Rogério said. We should always reassess the project. Of course, there are decisions that have to be made beforehand, but we should always know that external factors, determining factors for the advancement of this project are being met. We need resilience so that we can make adjustments, fill gaps without changing what made investors brave enough to invest in that project.
Speakers, I think we ran out of time, but the presentations were very comprehensive and sent a lot of messages to the audience. And I will leave it here because I understand to close, but certainly thank you all. It's been a great session and great hearing your ideas and your points. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan.